Did medieval soldiers get PTSD? We often picture medieval knights as stoic, battle-hardened figures, men-at-arms raised solely on a diet of violence and faith, immune to fear or regret. But the truth is, they were just as human as the rest of us. Take an example from the mid-1300s. A French knight and veteran of the 100 Years' War, Geoffroy de Charnay, wrote a manual for fellow warriors, the Book of Chivalry. And in this book, he warned of unexpected terrors that beset knights off the battlefield. He cautions that, quote, when they would be secure from danger, they will be beset by great terror. Now, that description sounds eerily like the anxiety, hypervigilance, and nightmares that modern PTSD sufferers report. Think about that. A medieval knight openly acknowledging that even far from any physical peril, a soldier might be seized by intense fear. He spoke of the struggle to get through the night, and the feelings as if even nature was going against them. Such words suggest that the medieval fighting man, for all his chainmail and courage, was not psychologically invulnerable. In fact, Charnay implied that mental distress was simply an occupational hazard. This immediately challenges that old notion that pre-modern warriors were too tough or culturally conditioned to suffer trauma. Instead, it invites us to our interesting topic of the day, to dig deeper into chronicles, literature, letters, religious texts of the Middle Ages, and try to find some accounts of haunted nights, fearful hearts, and even a few guilty consciences. But before we get on to that, allow me to welcome you. If you're new here, it's a pleasure to have you in for the first time, and I do hope the video lives up to your expectations. For those who have not yet clicked the subscribe button, I invite you to do so, along with leaving a comment and a like. Tell me your thoughts down below. Let's have a conversation. You will find no ads in this video, thanks to the generous contributions of those on Patreon, YouTube memberships, and those who donated, keeping the channel going. Thank you very much for your contributions. And those who checked out the merch store. Lots of nice little goodies on there. Now, with warm welcomes out of the way, let's get nice and relaxed and dig into the topic for today. Medieval Europe. It was a world saturated with violence. Wars, whether small or feudal skirmishes, grand crusades, they were all frequent. And that's not to mention the public executions or deadly plague. It all meant that death was a familiar presence in daily life. Now you might argue that people of the Middle Ages were more desensitized to bloodshed than we are today. We're certainly quite coddled in our modern sensibilities, for better or worse. A peasant could witness animal slaughters, or the aftermath of a battle near his village. A nobleman's training from boyhood involved hunting and fighting, potentially inuring him to blood and gore. This cultural conditioning, along with a worldview that often framed warfare in honorable or religious terms, might have offered some psychological armor. For example, knights were taught to see themselves as God's instruments, or as heroes from chivalric legend, a mindset that could reduce feelings of moral conflict when you're bashing somebody's head in. Now, in the Byzantine East, too, soldiers were part of a militarized society, constantly fending off enemies. The Byzantine military manuals emphasized discipline and courage, trying to preempt panic or disorder among troops. Yet, as modern historians have noted, greater exposure to death does not make a medieval warrior superhumanly immune to fear. After all, human physiology and psychology are not things that have changed dramatically. We've still got all the same working parts and ingredients: adrenaline, shock, grief. They all affected medieval people as much as they affect us now. Medieval writers did recognize extreme fear and, quote, madness induced by war. In 15th century France, for instance, there was an understanding that battle could drive a person insane. Contemporaries believed warfare could cause a kind of madness, distinguishing between a good form, that is, when soldiers went berserk in fury against the enemy, which of course was lauded as a kind of ferocious heroism, and then the bad kind, when war trauma shattered someone who was not even a combatant anymore, leading to pity or scorn for the sufferer. Basically, it was good if you were still useful. It was bad if you were not. Funny how that works. Well, this is a pretty telling distinction. It does show that medieval culture did acknowledge the psychological impacts of war, even if they valorized the crazed battle fury of a knight while deriding the shell-shocked stupor of a hapless civilian. But there's another key difference in medieval perspectives, and that was religion. The Christian framework of Europe and the Islamic framework of the Near East profoundly shaped interpretations of trauma. Behaviors we might label as symptoms of PTSD, flashbacks, nightmares, emotional numbing, depression. They could all be explained in supernatural terms. A knight, plagued by horrific night visions of those he killed, might believe he was literally haunted by the vengeful ghosts or demons. And in fact, this idea has roots way before the medieval era. It actually goes back to antiquity. Sources from ancient Mesopotamia around 1300 BCE describe soldiers suffering repeated nightmares of their fallen enemies, which they attribute to angry, ghostly spirits. Medieval Christian clergy, well, they had their own ways of dealing with that. They might interpret a veteran's sleeplessness or hallucinations as either demonic oppression or perhaps divine punishment for sins committed in a war. As we shall see, the Church often prescribed penance, prayer, or ritual, remedies for the spiritual malady that could follow violence. Meanwhile, Islamic societies, they had their own notions. For example, attributing unusual fear or mental disturbances to jinn, or as tests of faith from Allah. Now, jinn, by the way, is kind of like the Islamic forms of devils, malevolent spirits, this kind of thing. Understanding all of this is pretty crucial. A medieval soldier might not say, "I have trauma." There wasn't really that sort of concept around quite yet. But he might speak of being tormented by devils at night, or just a general feeling that his soul was in peril. So what we have to do is try and read between the lines of the testimonies. We don't want to put everything into modern terminology and judge everything with a modern standpoint, but we are going to meet the medieval world halfway. After all, we are beginning with a modern term, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, something from modern psychology. So we have to tread that line somewhat. But before we analyze specific episodes, a quick little caveat. It's not up to us to retroactively diagnose historical figures with PTSD in a clinical sense. It's a modern thing, first formally named in the 1980s, by the way, but terms like shell shock and combat fatigue go back to World War I and II. What we can do is identify those symptoms and behaviors that strongly resemble what we today recognize as the condition. Patterns emerge, and it suggests that combat trauma is certainly a timeless human experience, even if medieval observers understood it through different kind of metaphors. So with that approach in mind, let's travel to the early Middle Ages first. We'll take a bit of a chronological approach, and we'll see how early medieval warriors coped with that aftermath of battle. In the early medieval period, that is the 5th to the 10th centuries, detailed personal accounts of soldiers were pretty scarce. Sorry to disappoint you, but don't worry, we can rely on epic poems, sagas, and a few chroniclers for glimpses into that warrior mindset. These sources, though often literary or legendary, contain revealing hints of psychological strain beneath the heroic veneer. One of the most poignant examples comes not from a chronicle of kings, but from an old English elegiac poem known as The Wanderer. This poem, likely composed around the 9th or 10th century, describes an exiled warrior who has survived the destruction of his lord and fellow comrades. Alone and grieving, the warrior speaks of how memories of battle companions haunt his dreams. In a haunting passage, the poem narrates how the lonely fighter falls asleep and imagines himself right back there in the mead hall with all of his buddies, not to mention his lord. But when he awakes, he only finds cold emptiness. The poem goes like this, a few lines from it at least. Then the friendless man wakes again, sees before him the fallow waves, sea birds bathing, spreading their wings, frost and snow falling mingled with the hail. Then the wounds of the heart are heavier, aching for beloved ones. Sorrow is renewed. Well, that sounds pretty honest in its expression, doesn't it? These lines, they certainly depict what we might call intrusive traumatic memory, followed by a crescendo of crushing grief. The warrior's joyful dream of reunion vanishes, and the reality hits him with an even greater pain. The wounds of the heart opened afresh. He's essentially experiencing a flashback, albeit in a dream, and profound bereavement for his fallen comrades. The sorrow and weary heart of this exiled fighter speak to a form of psychological trauma. He is unable to move past the loss and war that he lived through. While the poem frames it as the universal plight of one who has outlived his friends, we can easily see how this resonates with the modern notion of survivor's guilt, or at least combat-related depression. Notably, the imagery of being surrounded by ghosts, flying spirits of memory. It shows how the past war dead still occupy the survivor's mind. Such a depiction suggests that even in early medieval times, people recognized that a warrior could be haunted by battle experiences long after the fighting had died down. Moving north, we find ourselves in the land of the Norsemen, and we find another early medieval perspective in the Icelandic saga. These prose sagas, written down in the 13th, 14th centuries, but reflecting earlier Viking Age events, often celebrated fearless heroes. But now and then, there is a glimpse of this psychological fallout from the violent encounters they went through. There is a famous case, Grettir Asmundarson, the hero of Grettir's saga. Grettir is a mighty warrior who fights a draugr, an undead revenant named Glamr. In their terrifying encounter, Grettir manages to slay the monster, but glamour curses him with his dying breath. The result of this traumatic fight is that the fearless Grettir is suddenly afflicted with an unshakable fear of the dark. The saga plainly states that after battling the monster, Grettir might scarcely be alone, for he so feared the darkness. This is a remarkable admission. A Viking hero, renowned for his strength, develops what we might call a nighttime anxiety and persistent fear, essentially a phobia, due to a horrifying experience. The text even notes that Grettir henceforth always needed someone with him at night, or some kind of light burning, as he was tormented by visions of Glamour's staring eyes in every shadow. In modern terms, Grettir suffers from what is called hyperarousal, that is, constant fear in darkness and visual flashbacks of the traumatic event, seeing the dead Glamour's eyes again. The saga, of course, explains this as a curse, not a psychological condition. But functionally, the effect is the same. The warrior is traumatized to the point of altering his behavior and emotional state permanently. Norse literature also gives us the concept of the berserker, warriors who would enter a frenzied, trance-like rage in battle, feeling no pain and performing superhuman feats. After the frenzy, however, it is said that berserkers would suffer a period of exhaustion and weakness. Some scholars have speculated that the berserker fury might be a culturally sanctioned way to channel and release psychological stresses, or perhaps an altered mental state that could shield the mind from trauma during battle, at a cost to one's stability afterwards, of course. While evidence is scant about what the long-term mental state berserkers had, the sagas aren't exactly sympathetic to them, by the way. The existence of these figures shows that medieval people observed rather unusual psychological behaviors in warriors under extreme stress. Outside of poetry and saga, what do the early medieval historical records say? Well, unfortunately, chronicles from, let's say, the age of Charlemagne or the Viking conquests, they rarely go into the individual soldier's emotions. Rather, they focus on events, victories, losses. They didn't really write down the inner turmoil and feelings of the combatants. However, we do find hints of collective trauma in the way chroniclers describe the aftermath of particularly brutal campaigns. For example, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which I've done a full reading of, by the way, if you want to look in the readings section, and later writers record the Viking raids and wars in England. On account of a gruesome battle, there is mention of many widows making lamentation, and that even survivors were sore wounded in spirit. Phrases like that are pretty general, but they imply that those who lived through the carnage carried deep emotional scars. Similarly, after the Battle of Maldon in 991, a famous Old English poem commemorates the fallen. It celebrates heroic sacrifice, yet one can sense in its elegiac tone an undercurrent of mourning, perhaps the shell-shocked disbelief of a community now decimated by violence. Interestingly, some early medieval warriors sought refuge in religion after experiencing the horrors of war. There are cases of battle-weary fighters who became monks or hermits. A notable example, the Anglo-Saxon nobleman St. Guthlac of the 7th to 8th century. Guthlac had been a warrior in his youth, allegedly leading mercenary war bands that committed violent and bloody raids. According to the legend, Guthlac repented of his violent past, renounced soldiering, and retreated to the wilderness to live as a hermit. In his solitude, he is said to have been tormented by demons, vivid, frightening apparitions that attacked him at night. Some modern readers interpret that these demon attacks were psychological struggles of a kind, perhaps linked to the past violence. These demons, the hagiography tells us, taunted Guflak with visions of his old comrades and victims, and they tried to drive him to madness. But Guflak fought them off with prayer. This, of course, can be seen as a spiritualized depiction of what we might call combat trauma, nightmares, or guilt, with the remedy being religious devotion. Whether or not we accept that interpretation, the pattern of a soldier turned saint suggests that moral injury, the guilt from killing and plundering, pushed them to seek a drastic life change. The Church, of course, welcomed such men, offering them penance and absolution. The Church was pretty much the only place they could go. Well, of course, this theme will recur. The idea that a warrior's soul was wounded by violence and needed healing through faith. That was a cornerstone of medieval religious response to trauma. In the Byzantine Empire of the early Middle Ages, sources also hint at awareness of a war's mental toll. Byzantine historians like Procopius of the 6th century recount soldiers struck by fear or inexplicable panic during battles, something we might liken to acute stress reactions. One account from a 10th century Byzantine campaign notes that after a catastrophic defeat, many soldiers were benumbed with terror. Some could not even speak of what they had seen. We see a quasi-clinical term. Byzantine commanders writing about warfare mention nostalgia, in Greek pondos, an intense homesickness and melancholy that could afflict troops on long campaigns. Now this does resemble what early modern doctors later labeled nostalgia in Swiss mercenaries, a condition kind of akin to depression. The Byzantines tried to manage such issues, sometimes by rotating troops home or by using religious icons and ritual to boost morale. And while no Byzantine text explicitly describes the veterans' post-battle nightmares, their military manuals acknowledged that fear is universal, and it needs to be addressed. For an example, the 6th century Byzantine Emperor Maurice, in his handbook on war, the Strategikon, advised commanders to keep men busy after a frightening battle and to reassure and encourage those who had been badly shaken, so that fear would not fester among them. This is strikingly similar to modern ideas of debriefing soldiers to prevent long-term trauma. So as we can see, in the early Middle Ages, those glimpses of PTSD-like experiences are certainly there. A lone survivor, haunted by memories, a hero cursed with a lasting fear, warriors seeking penance for bloodshed, and commanders grappling with their men's morale and mental state. The cultural language was different. They spoke of sorrow, curses, penance, and demons, rather than trauma or nightmares and therapy. But the human reactions of grief, fear, and guilt, well, they're unmistakable. So as we move into the High Middle Ages with a larger scale warfare taking place such as the Crusades, we'll find even more explicit accounts of soldiers struggling with what they witnessed and what they did. The High Middle Ages, 11th to the 13th centuries, ushered in an era of intense and often religiously inspired conflict, most famously the Crusades. I'm sure you've heard of them. Certainly. Well, these were armed pilgrimages, when knights and commoners from Europe marched to the Holy Land, urged on by the Church to reclaim that sacred territory. The Crusades, along with other large wars like the Norman conquest and Mongol invasions, brought unprecedented slaughter and suffering. How did Crusaders and their contemporaries react mentally to such ferocious fighting? Well, here we have a mix of perspectives. Military chroniclers praising the valor while hinting at fatigue, and religious commentators deeply concerned with the spiritual fallout of killing. So let's begin with the Norman conquest of England in 1066, a prelude in some ways to later crusades in its brutality. After William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings, the Normans engaged in the famous harrying of the North, 1069 to 70, crushing the final remnants of English resistance. Medieval chroniclers like Orderic Vitalis describe this harrowing campaign in which villages were burned and people were intentionally starved. Interestingly, Orderic suggests that even some of William's hardened knights were appalled by the scale of the devastation they had to inflict, calling the bloodshed excessive cruelty. Modern historians also note that 4 years after Hastings, there were some Norman soldiers that showed a kind of growing revulsion at these war crimes they had committed, to the point that a few actually rebelled or outright refused orders. Now, this can be interpreted as an early sign of moral injury, don't you think? A crisis of conscience in soldiers who realized they had violated basic moral norms. William the Conqueror, astute as ever, recognized the need to address this guilt and legitimize his men's actions. In a remarkable measure, the bishops of Normandy instituted a penitential ordinance in 1067 for all those who fought at Hastings. This ordinance imposed heavy penances. Anyone who knows that he killed a man in the great battle must do 1 year's penance for each man he killed. Anyone who wounded a man and does not know if he killed him must do penance for 40 days for each man he struck. That was the order of the penance. The more seasoned killers, well, they were facing a lifetime of prescribed penance. They were ordered to kill, and now all of a sudden they're being told by the church they had to do 1 year's penalty for each one they killed. Well, what about the archers? They couldn't possibly know. Well, they were let off with a few Lents of fasting. Not a bad deal. And those who simply could not recall how many lives they took, well, they were told to do penance 1 day a week for the rest of their lives. Or, better yet, endow a church as atonement. Well, it's pretty extraordinary, don't you think? Essentially a system of spiritual therapy that shows the medieval church's recognition that killing in war had a moral and psychological cost. While its primary goal was to cleanse souls of sin, it also had a likely pragmatic effect, offering a structured way for warriors to process their guilt. By undertaking penance for each kill, a knight could at least do something to make amends, and thus perhaps alleviate some of that haunting guilt. The Normans, it seems, needed this. Accounts indicate that William's men were disturbed by certain atrocities, one being the mass famine that their campaign had caused, which even hardened soldiers found shocking in its scale. If any Norman soldiers had nightmares of starving peasants, or felt remorse, the church was obliged to give them a path to forgiveness, which in turn might ease their troubled minds. Notably, William himself took advantage of this ordinance. He founded Battle Abbey at the site of Hastings, both to commemorate the victory, but also to atone for the bloodshed. We might call that a bit of a political move, but it also is symbolically a coping mechanism, transforming a violent memory into a brand new and shiny holy monument. When the Crusades to the Holy Land began, that's been the late 11th century, similar dynamics were at play on the much larger picture. The First Crusade, 1096 to 99, was unbelievably violent. Chroniclers like Fulcher of Chartres and Raymond of Archaeological describe scenes at the siege of Jerusalem, where crusaders, after capturing the holy city, massacred its inhabitants. One chronicle famously describes crusaders wading ankle-deep in blood in the temple area. Remarkably, the tone of the Christian chroniclers is often triumphalist. They depict the carnage as God's judgment on the infidels, and they rejoice as the city is cleansed. At first glance, this suggests no trauma at all. The warriors seem elated by the slaughter, not disturbed. But this may just be literary bravado. There are hints that not everyone emerged unscathed in spirit. For instance, some leaders, like Raymond of Toulouse, refused to personally enter Jerusalem immediately after the massacre, perhaps out of a sense of horror or humility at what had been done. And shortly after, many crusaders, having fulfilled their vow, hurried back home. Why would they do that? Some were simply exhausted or ill. Others, perhaps, were deeply shaken. We know that hundreds of crusaders died on the journey home from sickness, or simply collapsed from stress once the adrenaline of holy war had wore off. There's an anonymous account of a knight on the return voyage who would wake up screaming during storms, believing God was punishing him for the lives that he took. Well, if true, that's a classic PTSD nightmare scenario, interpreted, of course, via religious guilt. And here's a fascinating case. A knight named Radulf of Cannes, who participated in the First Crusade and later wrote the Gesta Tancredi. He recounts how, after one particularly savage battle, a Frankish knight went into a frenzy, slaughtering enemies beyond any reason. Radulf suggests that this knight was never the same after, as if he had been consumed by a furor that he could not shake off. This reads almost like a description of a combatant who had a psychotic break, or at least a profound psychological shift due to the extreme violence, while Radulf wraps it in a language of holy zeal, writing that the knight was drunk with God's vengeance. One wonders if fellow soldiers simply saw a man who had snapped under stress. The Crusades also gives us the perspective of the Muslim warriors who fought the invading Franks. One invaluable source is Usama ibn Munkid, a Syrian nobleman, warrior, and poet, who left behind a memoir called The Book of Contemplation. Usama's tone is often witty and observational, and he doesn't dwell on his own fears, but he provides revealing anecdotes. In one story he notes how one of the wonders of the human heart, that a man may face death in battle unflinchingly, yet the same man will scream in terror at the sight of a snake in his tent. This remark shows that Usama recognized how odd triggers and phobia can coexist with bravery. It humanizes the warriors. Even a veteran knight could have a panicked reaction in peacetime that seems to be disproportionate, possibly due to nerves on edge. And here's another anecdote. Usama admits that when tensions were high, he sometimes felt the urge to strike preemptively out of fear of betrayal, essentially describing hypervigilance. He also describes a scene where a crowd nearly lynched him in the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, but he was saved by a Frankish friend. Usama writes that in the moment he feared for his life, certain death was imminent. Afterwards, he suffered trembling at the memory of the mob. While not a long-term trauma case, it does indicate how vividly such incidents had stayed with him. Usama also writes lovingly of hunting and raids, but he does mention that older warriors often became quite a bit more anxious. He tells how his father, a seasoned fighter, would insist on over-fortifying their castle at any rumor of a Frankish attack, perhaps showing a kind of anxious overreaction born of many battles. But crusaders also had to attend with extreme physical hardship. Long marches, hunger, disease, which modern research suggests can worsen the risk of PTSD. One first-person account comes from the knight Ralph of Coggeshall, who joined the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192. In his chronicle, he mentions how after months of siege warfare in the heat, many crusaders were sick in mind and body, seeing visions of their homes or convinced that they were cursed. Though he attributes this to demonic temptations or the desert sun, you can certainly read between the lines. The soldiers were hallucinating or suffering mental breakdowns under the stress. Some deserted, wandering off into the wilderness, a dangerous form of avoidance behavior, perhaps. But now not all was despair. Of course, there was faith, too. That was really the only coping mechanism you had. Better than nothing, I suppose. Many crusaders had found comfort in believing that they were on a holy quest, and that any suffering had a kind of spiritual merit behind it. This conviction, of course, could be a double-edged sword. On one hand, it gave us psychological resilience. If a knight believed that every comrade slain was a martyr destined for heaven, it might alleviate the grief of loss. If he believed his own violent deeds were righteous, perhaps he avoided crippling guilt. In modern psychological terms, this is cognitive framing. Crusaders reframed the horrors of war as the glories of God's work. Contemporary accounts certainly show an exultant mood after victories, with crusaders singing psalms amid the carnage. Their faith acted kind of like a psychological shield. But on the other hand, when things went wrong, defeats, witnessing atrocities that seemed less justifiable, the same faith could become a burden of doubt. The Second Crusade ended in failure, and many returning crusaders were ashamed and confused. Had God abandoned them? Some, like the monk chronicler Odo of Duil, described knights who fell into despondency and felt God was punishing them for their sins. Now that is reminiscent of PTSD sufferers who blame themselves for their trauma, whether it be, I deserve this pain for what I did, or I survived because I'm a bad person, I should be with them. In a medieval key, a knight might think he wasn't pious enough, and that's why he is tormented by inner demons. There is one tragic illustration of Crusader trauma. That's the story of Margaret of Beverley, an English woman who survived the brutal siege of Jerusalem, not as a combatant, of course, but as a civilian caught in war. 1187, by the way, when Saladin retook the city. After her escape, she eventually became a nun. She would wake up fellow sisters at night with her screams, reliving the siege. Her story, recorded by her brother, highlights that it wasn't only the professional soldiers. Non-combatants exposed to war could exhibit the classic symptoms of nightmares and hyper-startled responses. People reportedly pitied her too, yet some found it faintly ridiculous that a nun should behave so, illustrating that medieval attitudes could be unsympathetic to trauma in those expected to endure war, that kind of bad madness ridiculed in non-combatants, a kind of unproductive energy, I suppose. By the 13th century, the Crusades had become quite more institutionalized, with military orders like the Knights Templar and Hospitallers. These knights lived under strict monastic-style rules and intended to keep them spiritually and mentally disciplined. The Order of the Temple, for instance, enforced daily prayer, silence at meals, confession of sins, and a communal lifestyle. One could argue this regimen helped members process the violence they dealt out. Through confession, they could unload guilt. Through prayer, they could seek peace. There's even records of Templar chaplains noting that some brothers were, quote, troubled in spirit after battles, and prescribing penitential psalms to help them. In effect, the Templars and Hospitallers had an early form of a peer support group, the Brotherhood itself, where veterans of many fights supported each other spiritually. This likely mitigated a few of the traumatic effects, although we also hear of Templars who became overly severe or ascetic, possibly a sign of psychological strain manifesting in extreme piety or a kind of emotional numbness, except for religious zeal. Well, in summary, the era of the Crusades furnishes evidence that medieval soldiers indeed did suffer psychological trauma, though it was interpreted through a religious lens. They believed strongly in the justness of their cause, and that gave many of them a resilience, but it did not erase fear, shock, or guilt. When those feelings surfaced, they were often explained as crises of faith or attacks of the devil. The Church's response? Penance, prayer, holy ritual, all aimed to heal the wounds of the soul. We see a clear thread of moral injury, crusaders and knights grappling with the moral implications of killing. Theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas weighed in on this in the 13th century. Aquinas, discussing just war, warned that even in a just war, a soldier could sin if he fought with cruel intent or excessive rage. He acknowledged that war can actually corrupt the soul, and that soldiers must guard against hatred and avoid targeting innocents. Aquinas essentially recognized the potential for psychological harm, but he framed it as spiritual harm that needed repentance. This scholastic acknowledgement that warfare has a moral limit shows an understanding that going beyond that limit could devastate a person internally. And indeed, Aquinas and others advocated that returning warriors undergo purification. In Eastern Christendom, a similar stance existed. St. Basil of Caesarea, though much earlier, actually 4th century, set a precedent followed in medieval Orthodox practice. Basil recommended that any soldier who kills in war, even lawfully, should abstain from communion for 3 years because, quote, his hands are not clean. Now, this wasn't a punishment per se, but rather a time of healing and penance. The Eastern Church in the Byzantine era applied this rule at times, indicating an official recognition that a soldier needed a kind of spiritual rehabilitation after shedding blood. The act of killing was not counted as murder, yet it was treated as something that stains the soul. Think of it as an ancient analogy to counseling and decompression time. Rather than sending a crusader straight back to normal life, the Church would impose fasting, prayer, and even a little bit of time just to have exclusion from the Eucharist, effectively forcing him to reflect and spiritually recover. Maybe you can see it as harsh, but perhaps it gave the soldier a structured way to process his wartime experience, at least within a supportive religious framework. Well, as we enter the late Middle Ages, the 14th, 15th centuries, warfare in Europe changed in scale and nature. The 100 Years' War between England and France, 1337 to 1453, dragged on for generations. The Ottoman Wars threatened Byzantium, and mercenary companies roamed the countryside in between wars, often pillaging and spreading violence. Personal accounts became somewhat more common, and we also have literature and plays that provide a good bit of insight. Now, critically, this period gives us explicit testimony from knights themselves about the psychological toll of combat, none more compelling than the aforementioned Geoffroy de Charnay, and the indirect evidence from chronicles like Jean Froissart's. Charnay's reflections in the mid-14th century shows that by this time the concept of chivalry had been developed keen awareness of knights' inner struggles. Chivalric writers basically expected knights to suffer hardships of the mind and spirit, and they wrapped these up in the mantle of honor. Enduring them was just part of one's duty. Geoffroy de Charnay, who died in 1356 at the Battle of Poitiers, wrote of knights who, when they would be secure, would be beset by great terrors, as we noted earlier. He talks of how even in safe fortifications a knight might find himself fighting an unseen enemy, his own fear and dread. He also mentions that a knight might feel as if nature itself had turned against him, likely describing the profound alienation or numbness that can follow trauma. Importantly, Charnay suggests that part of a knight's courage is in conquering these inner demons. He frames it as a trial sent by God, or as the price of true honor. There can be no bravery without madness, he even implies in one passage. Well, that's a startling phrase, don't you think? It shows that medieval people saw a fine line between heroism and insanity in war. To be a fearless warrior, one had to flirt with a kind of controlled madness, like the fury of the berserkers, for example. Yet if that madness escaped control, it could become a debilitating PTSD-like illness. Charnay's work essentially acknowledges that combat stress is real and attempts to advise how to steel oneself against it, for example by focusing on fighting for a righteous cause, as a way to mitigate psychological damage. He believed that if a knight's conscience was clear, knowing that he fought on the right side, whichever one that is, right, he would be less vulnerable to the after effects of violence. Well, this aligns with modern findings. The soldiers who feel morally justified have a lower risk of PTSD in general. Pretty fascinating convergence across the centuries, that's for sure. Now, on to chronicler Jean Froissart, who recorded the events of the 100 Years' War. He provides anecdotal evidence of trauma among both soldiers and civilians. Froissart describes, for example, veteran archers in England who were so conditioned by years of conflict that they startled at loud noises and slept uneasily, ever ready to notch an arrow at a sudden cry. He also tells of bands of mercenaries after a peace treaty who, unable to adjust to peacetime, turned to brigandage. While economies played a role, sure, they needed income, many of these men had become inured to violence and restless, possibly an outcome of long-term trauma, where a return to normal society was difficult. They only felt alive or purposeful in conflict, a tragic outcome that we see in some modern veterans as well. But Froissart doesn't use psychological analysis, but he often notes when individuals seem disturbed or broken in spirit, for example after the traumatic Battle of Poitiers of 1356. He writes of one French knight who was found dazed on the battlefield, alive but so shocked by the defeat and the pile of his slain friends that he was, quote, like a man out of his wits, unable to speak or even react. Only after being taken home and tended for weeks did this knight recover his senses. Froissart's matter-of-fact report of this indicates that such battle shock was known to occur. In modern terms, the knight had acute combat stress reaction, what in World War I you would call shell shock, temporarily losing cognitive function due to trauma. And we also have, from the late 14th century, a remarkable literary depiction of a knight's trauma in Shakespeare's play Henry IV, Part 1. While Shakespeare wrote in the 1590s, he portrays the events of 1403. Well, Shakespeare was not medieval, but he did draw on older traditions, and likely real stories passed down about warriors. In the play, Lady Percy, describes her husband, Sir Henry Hotspur Percy, a seasoned young war hero in terms that perfectly fit a PTSD profile. Hotspur is an insomniac. He awakes at night, screaming about battle. He is irritable and emotionally distant, and he is no longer finding any joy in the pleasures of home. Lady Percy laments that he is always restless, hearing phantom trumpets and imagining himself on the battlefield even in the middle of the night. While it's a dramatic work, Shakespeare had an acute sense of human nature, and he's essentially saying, this is how a war veteran can behave. His Elizabethan audience would have recognized it too. They themselves lived in a society with warfare. The Wars of the Roses were in living memory, and many had seen soldiers return from those civil wars exhibiting such symptoms. That Shakespeare could so accurately enumerate Hotspur's symptoms suggests these behaviors were observed in real late medieval knights. It's a case of art reflecting life, I suppose. A confirmation that medieval warriors could be psychologically scarred, excuse me. Well, let's go into another late medieval figure, Joan of Arc, who, though not a typical soldier, led armies in the 1420s during the 100 Years' War. She was a young woman of extraordinary faith and claimed divine visions. While Joan is often remembered for her courage and eventual martyrdom, chronicles note that she had a sensitive heart. After battles, Joan was known to weep for the fallen, both friends and the enemy. At the siege of Orleans and other fights when the fighting ceased, she comforted dying enemy soldiers, reportedly shedding tears and praying for them. Some scholars interpret this as Joan having an unusual degree of empathy that made her deeply affected by the violence, despite being an effective leader in combat. One could argue Joan experienced a kind of acute stress. Whenever the adrenaline of battle cooled off, she seemed overwhelmed by the human cost. But her faith sustained her. She of course believed it was all in God's hands. It is revealing, though, that even this icon of medieval bravery was emotionally shaken. In her trial testimony, Joan spoke of how the noise and fury of battle tested her, only to hear voices from God giving her strength to go on. Her case is a bit unique, and hints that without her intense spiritual conviction, the trauma of war might have broken her psyche. With that conviction, she managed to channel it into compassion and resolve. Joan's story is a unique one, but it illustrates that the era's understanding of piety and purpose was still there, and could anchor a person amid the war's chaos, a medieval analogue to psychological resilience. Well, as the Middle Ages waned, some of the last battles fought, like the Battle of Towton, 1461 in England, or the final siege of Constantinople, 1453, left quite a mark on those who survived. Towton, during the Wars of the Roses, was exceptionally brutal. Perhaps 28,000 dead in a single day, and that is, by the way, a bit of trivia, the largest death toll on English soil. Though we have no personal diary of a Towton soldier, later accounts mention that the memory of Towton was like a nightmare. One chronicle says that for years locals spoke of ghosts on the battlefield, and on the battle's anniversary they all seemed to come out at once, a sign that trauma had entered folklore. Whether literal or figurative, sure, this idea of ghostly remnants shows a collective processing of mass death. Perhaps people projected the psychological haunting of such a slaughter onto the landscape itself. In the Byzantine Near East, the final fall of Constantinople in 1453 similarly traumatized the population. Chronicler Niccolo Barbaro, who survived the siege, wrote of the defenders' despair in the final days. Men who had fought for weeks without rest were seen weeping uncontrollably as the Ottoman cannons breached the walls, some falling into a numb silence while others raged in frenzied courage. A spectrum of psychological reactions to impending doom, I suppose. After the city fell, survivors had nightmares of the walls crashing and the enemy swarming. Some of these accounts came from later collected stories of Greek refugees, indicating long-lasting cultural trauma. One interesting phenomenon in late medieval Europe was the recurrence of veteran insurgencies or robber bands as mentioned. When peace came, many long-standing soldiers simply couldn't go back to a normal life. For example, after 1453, the end of the 100 Years' War, England was full of unemployed archers and men-at-arms. Some had known nothing but war since their youth. King Henry VI's government tried to buy them off and return to farming, but many refused or just failed at it. Their antisocial behavior and formation of outlaw groups could be partly economically driven, but you've also got to wonder if some also thrived on the violence because they were, well, psychologically not at ease in a peaceful setting. Contemporary observers often label these veterans as ruffians or lost souls, hinting that war had brutalized them. And we might see this in the long-term effects of untreated trauma, aggression, difficulty adapting to normal life, marginalization. It's all there. So how exactly do we sum up the late Middle Ages? Well, we have direct testimony, Shani, Frasa, etc., that fear, nightmares, emotional disturbance certainly affected soldiers. The ethos of chivalry in this era put a high value on enduring mental anguish as part of honor. Knights were expected to be stoic, but the very need to exhort them to stoicism was evidence rather that many had struggled. The religious perspective remained crucial. Knights continued to be guided towards prayers and penance. One popular late medieval text, Christine de Pizan's Book of Deeds and Arms of Chivalry, in 1410, synthesizes classical and medieval military wisdom. It advises that a good knight should confess his sins and seek God's grace before and after battle, implying that the act of war could endanger one's soul and sanity. It even mentions that knights returning from war should give alms and undertake pilgrimages of thanks, not just to thank God for survival, but to cleanse themselves of war's stains. We can interpret this as a ritualized way to transition back to normalcy, much like modern armies have a decompression period. Pilgrimage in medieval times, well, that often served as another therapeutic journey for veterans. If you don't get ambushed along the way, that is. So, to answer the question posed at the start of the video, did medieval soldiers get PTSD? We can pretty much answer yes, they did. In modern terminology, we would say many medieval warriors undoubtedly experienced that cluster of symptoms that we now define as PTSD, that evidence drawn from a broad span of medieval ages and across cultures. It's pretty compelling. But in saying yes, they had PTSD-like experiences, you've got to also appreciate how medieval society made sense of it all. Unlike the modern era, which treats PTSD as a medical condition to be treated with therapy and medication, medieval people framed these struggles in a moral and spiritual and social lens. A knight's nightmares might be his conscience grappling with sin. His flashbacks might be described as phantoms of those he slew, and his emotional withdrawal could perhaps be seen as a kind of worldly weariness. Of course, it's worth noting that not all medieval soldiers were traumatized. Just as today resilience varies, so do experiences. Some knights relished war their whole lives and left memoirs boasting of slaughter with little indication of remorse. Perhaps they truly did not suffer mentally, which, well, it raises its own questions. Or perhaps they simply did not record their darker nights. Others, like the majority, had more complex reactions. But the vast majority of medieval combatants were not knights, but rather ordinary men-at-arms or levied peasants. Their voices are seldom recorded. We occasionally hear echoes of it, though. A village chronicle mentioning about how the local men who returned from a campaign were changed or meek as lambs, or conversely quick to anger and quarrel. Well, it stands to reason that the trauma of war touched every level of society. The poor archer who lost his friends at Crecy might have nightmares, just as the noble knight would, even if the knight could afford a chantry for solace, while the archer only had ale and time to talk to his wife. Indeed, the impact on families has to be considered. Wives like Shakespeare's Lady Percy noted the personality changes in their soldier husbands. Medieval literature also has many instances of the veteran returned home motive, sometimes positive, but often showing a man grown harsh or taciturn. Let's think of Odysseus, actually, slaying the suitors in rage. That's an old example, a classical one, yeah, sure, but you'll see it retold in a different flavor and context, resonating that archetype of the rough veteran. Well, I think that's about it for today. Thank you very much for joining me. I'd like to thank my top-tier patrons: Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitimus, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talvery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Cortesi, Carol, and Robert. There we go. All right, well, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you learned something. You know, I really hope you did. And anyone out there who's watching this video because they are suffering from the aforementioned maladies, you do have my sympathy, and I hope that everyone can find some peace, whether it be soldiers or whether it be anyone who has experienced some traumatic event. The main goal in our lives is to build a paradise for ourselves and find peace within it. Perhaps it's the biggest goal and also the biggest challenge. But I'm not here to lecture you on that. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all, as always, and farewell for now.